All right, welcome everyone. I'll just briefly introduce myself. My name is Chinmayi. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in California, so on the west coast of the US, born and raised here. And my background is sort of a mix of humanities and the sciences. In undergrad, I studied medical humanities and integrated some neuroethics into there as well through coursework, capstone papers, things like that. And then I was at Columbia for undergrad and I stayed there for grad school as well, where I got a master's of public health in neuroepidemiology and psychiatric epidemiology, and happy to chat about that as well. And then prospective medical school ahead. So hopefully that happens in the next couple of years down the line. And as for work in general, I'm really excited about neuroethics, cross-cultural neuroethics, neurotechnology, and all of those intersections. Also really enjoy being a part of more community engagement and next generation education. I'm the founder of Simply Neuroscience. So this community is really something that's, of course, near and dear, and really enjoy those more public facing communication aspects as well. So happy to chat about any and all of those topics as well. But as for neuroethics, it's it's definitely a growing field, and it's one that's actually surprisingly quite new. It's only a couple of decades old, which considered to maybe some aspects of neuroscience are a few more decades older than that. And ethics and philosophy, of course, that intersection as a whole goes back hundreds and thousands of years. So neuroethics has emerged as a very unique niche. And we'll chat about that and why specifically, we should think about neuroethics, right? And why it is important for all of our careers and activities, regardless of whether you consider yourself a philosopher or not. Neuroethics is important in some way, shape, or form, especially when we think about what is the impact of the work that we do in neuroscience, whether that's research, whether that's clinical, whether that's advocacy, education, in any regard, any aspect. There's always ethical principles to keep in mind, and especially when we think about more of the impact of neuroscience on society. That's actually, in fact, what I currently do in my role as a neuroscience and society fellow at the Data Foundation, and which is a philanthropic organization based out of New York, invests in many neuroscience and society initiatives. And I bring that up also because I want to give a disclaimer that all the information I share is here in personal capacity and does not necessarily represent the views of the foundation. So with that, I actually want to kind of trace back a little bit to where did neuroethics kind of come from? So the premise is that in 2002, which perhaps some of us were born or around that time, or some of us were not, but in 2002, there was a gathering of many top neuroscientists, many philosophers, academics from a variety of disciplines who came together actually in San Francisco. I believe, and had one of the first or very first convenings dedicated to neuroethics and in defining what exactly was the scope of the field. So what they came down to at the end of the day was seeing neuroethics as a growing subset that is apart from bioethics in some ways, shapes, and forms. And the reason for that is a little bit different depending on who you may ask. The way that I have personally understood that growth and that subset of neuroethics is thinking about how the brain itself carries its own identity, whether that's related to consciousness, matters of free will. The brain is just such a enigma and quite literally a mysterious gray box that introduces so many more big questions to think about in terms of how do we define our own humanity and our identity and our sense as humans, I think, compared to what certain bioethics disciplines might think about. There has also been some discussion about how perhaps the bioethics space, or the more any intersection of the science with the ethics space, especially bioethics, has focused more on clinical applications and thinking about you might see ethics committees at hospitals, ethical review boards, IRBs, for instance, if anyone has ever been a part of a research study and had to go through the protocols and approvals for there. So there are basically this very much, there have developed a very close ties between bioethics and kind of institutions and clinical institutions, especially over the years. The hope with neuroethics is, of course, is we're going to talk about all things brain, all things nervous system, and think not only within the clinical space, but also into law, into technology, and into what consumers should know more broadly. So what do I mean by that? How many of y'all have heard of these emerging neurotechnology companies, maybe such as Neuralink, right? Neuralink is a pretty big name. It's led by you know who, Mr. Musk. And so companies like this have become more well known among the general public. And though some of other wellness companies and consumer tech products are ones that maybe are like wearables, where they say, we've developed this X, Y, and Z product. You can put it on over your ears just like a regular old headset. And perhaps it's going to emit certain waves, or it's going to focus on some sort of brain function or aspect or functionality that we can modulate and modify without it being invasive, as in without having to get surgery to get something implanted. So there are many wellness products and companies out there in neurotechnology space that say we want to do X, Y, and Z. And the end goal and hope of that is we want to alleviate some sort of perhaps symptom that's negative. Maybe, for instance, with the case of depression or anxiety, we want to help individuals who find themselves in a certain state and need support and help. And maybe our product or our innovation can be that. And in some cases, it may be more for general wellness. We want to be more cognizant of mood regulation or attention, for example, for students, perhaps for athletes, and a whole variety of basically uses that don't necessarily have to be directly tied into as much of clinical diagnoses as much as wellness. That might be the same as taking something that's over the counter in a pharmacy where you're like, okay, this might be good for me. A doctor isn't prescribing this for me. I don't need this for a certain health condition, but I think it might be good for me and I want to try it out. So there is that general sense of accessibility, you know? With companies like Neuralink. Of course, you may have noticed that a lot of the discussions focus on actual surgical implantation of electrodes. That's invasive technology, of course, and comes with a whole set of clinical repercussions to think about. But considering now that you may be relatively able to purchase consumer neurotechnologies, though I will acknowledge they are quite expensive, and that relates to a point about equity that we'll get to in a moment. What do we really need to make sure comes across to general consumers? We can't really expect people to sit down and read all of the potential publications out there in academia about neurotechnology and neuroethics, can we? That would not quite be practical. So how do we make sure that we are playing the role of an effective and efficient and a messenger overall, a comprehensive messenger who conveys the pros and the cons? Neuroethics tries to fill that. And that depends, of course, on individual practitioners who come from a variety of backgrounds. Pure neuroscientists, clinicians, lawmakers, policymakers, lawyers themselves, and philosophers, researchers, everyone all together as well. So that's kind of the history of it a little bit. I know quite a bit there. So let me pull up some interesting maybe visuals that we can use to kind of piece together some of the common themes about neuroethics that I want to bring it up. And I hope that you will see and notice some of these in the fictional hypothetical case studies as well. So let me sorry, give me 1 second here. Can y'all see that okay?
Yes.
Yay, thanks. And thanks, folks, throwing up those thumbs up. Okay, so I first want to give a author credit here. So a couple of my colleagues and mentors at an organization called Brain Mind put this together, more of an infographic, a visual format a few years ago. And this is open access, and I can drop the link in the chat later as well. But I just find it incredibly useful in kind of tracking a little bit of those timeline of neuroethics that we spoke about a little bit, and also looking at how to use it. What are some of the key principles? So I do want to give a shout out to BrainMind here in building this infographic. So we talked a little bit about neuroethics. Why do we need it? The brain has different specific issues that are distinct from bioethics. I kind of mentioned some of the more personal identity aspects. Mental privacy, freedom of thought, autonomy, mental integrity are also words that you will see come up quite a bit. And how do we use it? In terms of thinking about in the innovation space, for example, with these neurotechnology products that I've been mentioning, it comes into the actual ideation part. How do you design a product? What kinds of gaps or needs does it address and fill? What are the kinds of communities that it's targeting, right? Tying back to the equity issue, is this product only really accessible to people who can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars? Or is this something that we can have and see in something like CVS or Walgreens or your neighborhood pharmacy, right? One day, or maybe even order off of something like Amazon Marketplace one day. There's also something that needs to be introduced at more of the investing level. There's actually already kind of been a push to have more responsible investors or venture capitalists who basically are not just thinking about profit, of course, and returns on investment when they are looking at neurotechnology startups or companies, but also very much acting as a kind of a watch person, a cautionate agent, or an agent who is basically being cautious, a cautious agent, and making sure that innovation that is very much concerned about neuroethics and holds it at its heart is one that's being sent and approved and uplifted rather than kind of signaling, okay, there's some red flags here that need to go back to the drawing board. Patient engagement and education and training side alluded to a little bit. And lastly, there's in terms of thinking about a little bit about policy. Why are we bringing up policy here? So a fun fact that it's a fun fact, but a fact I learned about just a couple of days ago is that there is a push happening right now to have neuro rights and neuroethics frameworks embedded into basically policy protections as they would be for a variety of other consumer products and acts. And I believe Colorado was the first in the United States. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. But also California just signed a bill or signed a policy related to this and neuro rights protections happening. There's an entire organization called the Neuro Rights Foundation that is founded by Dr. Raphael Yuste. I hope I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. He's based out of Columbia University. Neuro Rights Foundation is a great one to check out as well in terms of resources on more of the policy making side of it. But basically, TLDR, innovation is happening, as you've probably seen, at a very rapid pace. Maybe things that we didn't think about 5 years ago are not happening. And they're going to continue to be rapidly emerging and growing. So we really need to make sure that there isn't as much of a lag in terms of laws and policies, not just in the US, I mean this globally too, in making sure that there's really not, the innovation isn't outpacing regulations, because regulations are meant to be sources of caution, making sure that things don't harm people. And there's always, unfortunately, been a little bit of a lag in terms of innovation and then policy trying to catch up. But we really need to make sure, especially in the neurotechnology space, that that lag is shortening and not widening as we see a lot of these advancements. So that's kind of what's meant by their popping that up. So some of the common themes. So privacy is definitely one. Neural data is very much kind of what we know about it is kind of the tip of the iceberg, to put it frankly. We may collect data on something that seems really innocuous, maybe something like sleep patterns, right? Maybe you have, your Apple iPhone or your Apple Watch, and you wear it at night, or maybe you set your phone, on your next to you on your bed at night, and it tracks your sleep cycles, and it can kind of predict like, oh, you're up now, you're not, you're fidgeting around, things like that. There's a lot of wearables, Fitbits, and whatnot that kind of serve the same purpose of tracking your sleep health. But what do we really know in terms of storage regarding that? Is your data secure and private? Could you potentially be identified in reverse from your brain data? And a wearable isn't necessarily reading your brain, but any sort of outputs of neural data. Could you potentially be reverse identified? What I mean by that is, let's say all the data is anonymized, but there is something about you. There's something that's unique about you, like a brain fingerprint, that could be reverse identified even from anonymized data. Is that a concern? And again, tip of the iceberg, we still don't know. And maybe those sleep patterns might be given to third-party agents or made accessible to them to then use for their own research purposes or commercial purposes. And then maybe all of a sudden, your sleep patterns are now being used for some other kind of completely different tone of research. And though we might hope it's for good, we can't always really be sure of that. So where's the data going? Kind of scary to think about. Agency and identity. How do brain technologies really affect our sense of self and our free will? Think about invasive technologies, for instance. What do we really know about the extent to which they might modulate or modify our behaviors and our patterns of action? So what is us versus what is really our sense of who we are when we have perhaps a device that might be influencing our mood, our behavior, our personality. What does that look like? And how do we really differentiate between them? Dual use is one. So that's kind of on the note of research I was mentioning earlier. Imagine that there's a scientist who's setting out to do perhaps some research related to retinal vision and perhaps restoring vision for certain individuals who may have had vision impairments or disabilities or an accident and trying to restore vision. That's obviously vision is something that's related to back to neuroscience as well. But let's say that there is perhaps a prosthetic or a device that's really showing promise in the space and restoring vision for individuals. But then there is also a potential gray area, and maybe this could be spun out for military purposes to enhance vision of individuals who are in the military or the army or soldiers, basically. And how does that kind of function when it has an unintended negative dual use? Well, the use was intended for good, but now it has this negative second use as well, the dual use. How do we safeguard against that? Right? Capacity and consent. How do we really ensure that, again, the general public is fully aware of all the fine print? And it's difficult to sit and do that for every single contract that you sign and every single product that you use. So how do we really make sure that individuals know what they're signing up for? Consent, right? Informed consent is such a hallmark of clinical research for anyone who's been a part of that space. And how do we really make sure that we're carrying that out fully in this neuroscience and neuroethics space as well? Kind of relating back to public education and awareness, we want to make these neuroethics concepts something that is easily understandable, something that is a kind of a little question or a little thinking cap that pops up when people are reading the news about these really flashy looking advancements. And how do we make sure that it's not just a one-time thing, but rather that it's something that feels natural and embedded for the general public? How do we ensure the safety? Of course, this comes into a lot of making sure we're doing due diligence in the actual development process. And also, even after a product, research technology, or whatever has launched, that there is room to modify as needed. If we know that the uses are not really being as we intended for them to be, there's some gaps still, there's some harm happening. How do we ensure that there is still the capacity to restore and come back to that drawing board and that the damage has not been going too far or doing too much to people? And I mentioned financial equity here in terms of when products cost hundreds and thousands of dollars, how do we really make sure that brain-based therapeutics are really accessible to everyone? And also in terms of thinking about access, I think we see that there are many of these epicenters of innovation relevant to neuroethics are taking place in the US and in Canada and in Europe. And the global South continues to be left out of a lot of these conversations. So when we think about consumer neurotechnologies, even, are we once again, unfortunately, not leveling the playing field where the more industrialized countries and citizens of those countries continue to access more and more further technologies that are just supplementing in a way that may not even necessarily be needed versus individuals from lower and middle income countries and from the global South do not have the same baseline access. And what does that mean? Perhaps even think about it in terms of as many of us being students and trainees. There are now these wearables that claim to help you get into a hyper-focused state of attention. And what does that mean when you're a student who perhaps is taking a international exam that many other individuals around the world also take, but you have this leg up compared to your peers? How does that work, right? And that could even be the case of some of these discussions about nootropics and medications and stimulants, all of those too. There's very differing accessibility and regulations surrounding those from country to country. That's why a lot of, sorry, just some background noise. That's why there's been a big movement to try and set up more regional governing neuroethics bodies and committees, International Brain Initiative. For example, in the US, there's now a neuroethics working group at the level of the NIH and Brain Initiative, but also make sure that many other countries are picking up speed on that. I believe there's now ones in South Korea, I want to say China, India, Japan, Australia, I believe too. So it's popping up in a lot of the countries too, but making sure that, again, all this work is very much taking place and not just well, Europe and North America. One really amazing shout out I want to give is to I'd say a collaborator and a mentor as well, Dr. Olivia Machivane, who is based in South Africa right now and is leading a really amazing neuroethics group in, I've never pronounced this university name out loud, I'm realizing, Stellenbosch, I believe, University. So really spearheading an amazing movement. And there's many collaborators involved too. But I think oftentimes a lot of these neuroethics efforts start from the ground up, from the work of certain individuals themselves, to then build into larger coalitions of many hundreds and thousands of people. So I think that's just to say, kind of, even where we see there's a lot of work to be done, it starts from oftentimes really individuals, and perhaps many of y'all too, right? So some examples, there have been a lot of published guidelines and frameworks trying to define neuroethics' prospects and outlooks and futures. So that's definitely a lot of these, like whatever ones have been mentioned here, I would highly suggest looking those up and referencing those. It's really amazing to kind of see the evolution even over the past like 20, 22 something years. There's been a lot of discussions, of course, some of the milestones and some of the really big foundations and organizations involved. So there's the Neuro Rights Initiative and the Neuro Rights Foundation that I mentioned earlier. The OECD is based out of Europe. I'm blanking on which country specifically, but they are also very much spearheading a lot of the technology side of conversations. The International Neuroethics Society is a fully dedicated organization and a community for individuals who basically live, breathe, and love everything neuroethics. So they're very trainee friendly, I will say. So I would highly recommend getting involved. And I'll share a little bit about some of their opportunities in a second too. The Data Foundation has also very much been a neuroethics voice for quite some time, shifting more to neuroscience and society, but definitely a leading voice there as well. And the last, let's see, implementation challenges. This is kind of the graph I mentioned. I should scroll down earlier in terms of thinking about technological advancement and the lag in political change. Call to action. Last thing I do want to mention here is the voices in the field. And again, thinking about where we currently are in our careers as maybe high school, college, grad school, maybe you're working and looking to still figure out where exactly is your niche in the neuroscience field, is that you can really approach neuroethics from a variety of different vantage points. In terms of researchers, oh, there's a typo there. I just noticed that scientist is spelled not quite right. But if you are, for instance, a more research heavy, academia heavy person, there's always need of people who are at the forefront of research to then look back and work together with ethicists and neuroethicists. Philosophers are very much needed to not only really summarize and reflect and propose and synthesize knowledge from across hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of works across the many years that humans have been around, having a little bit of a historical lens, but also looking ahead, making sure, working with educators, that philosophy of neuroscience is not necessarily one that is exclusive in the way that it's been for many years, but also translated quite honestly and quite practically in a manner that's important for the day-to-day person to understand, the lay person to understand. In the private sector, I alluded to, for instance, people who are involved in developing startups, but also making sure that there's responsible investments and financial investments happening in the right direction there. Think about product designers. We could even potentially open up a can of worms thinking about the ethics of neuromarketing and how behavioral insights then translate to perhaps some not advisors, advertisers implementing some relatively shady practices when it comes to selling their products. Targeted ads, I think, kind of run a slippery slope a little bit in some ways, but that could go to quite a far extreme. So there is one for sure there. Clinicians, very important in terms of there's a lot of psychiatric conditions and mental health conditions, and neurodiversity especially is also a very, very much a growing area in neuroethics. When we think about a lot of these technologies and startups are focused around these issues and conditions. So being involved in that space. Surgeons, especially when you think of, for example, deep brain stimulation and implants and electrodes related to that for Parkinson's patients, that's something that neurosurgeons do work with Parkinson's patients to surgically administer DBS. So I think neurosurgeons are definitely involved in that conversation, and physicians as well, neurologists, for example, psychiatrists. I think there's quite a bit of voices present there as well, quite a few voices present there as well. Um, Policymakers mentioned the need for, the policy lag to catch up. That's important. And then on the public side too, you have these really amazing advocacy organizations and platforms out there, like for example, the American Brain Coalition, who's definitely playing the role of a liaison between a variety of stakeholders and nonprofits. The nonprofit sector definitely continues to grow in terms of neuroethics opportunities. You may come across centers such as the Hastings Center, which let me put that name in the chat. The Hastings Center is also putting together a really fascinating report on neuroethics right now, a series of articles on neuroscience and society more broadly, but basically foundations and institutions like these, which exist a bit separately from universities and from hospital systems, but are needless to say, very important liaison sort of roles in the space. So cool, I've been talking for a while. So let me pause there in terms of the whole neuroethics first, right? And let me maybe pivot in the next few or so minutes before we take some questions to, all right, you're here. Maybe you have an interest in neuroethics. Where do you go from here, right? That's the whole thing. Actions, 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 actions. So some resources that I would recommend is first and foremost, the International Neuroethics Society, who, if anyone is based in Europe or is interested in traveling to Europe, they have an annual meeting coming up in April in Germany. So they're a great group to tap into. But I would say that annual neuroethics meetings are quite intimate, about 200 or 300 people. So it's honestly one of the smaller neuroscience conferences that you will see. And opportunities to submit posters, opportunities for trainees to go and network and socialize. There's really individuals from such a diverse set of disciplines represented at the annual meeting and on the broader conference as well. So keep an eye out there. They have some also great resources in terms of experts and examples of people who are in the neuroethics field and what they do. And especially one of the hallmark initiatives they have is, aside from monthly webinars, which you can tap into if you are a part of their newsletter or following them on social media, is there's this really wonderful annual neuroethics essay contest. So trainees, it's really for trainees, and you can do a more general article, an academic article, a video essay, all of those forms. I think it's a great chance to kind of sit down and address the issue that you're really passionate about, do some deep digging into there, put it together comprehensively, submit it, hopefully get some prizes and some recognition too, right? So, and full disclosure here, I was judging this neuroethics essay contest in the past. I was on the INS student postdoc committee. I wrapped up my term, so I may rejoin in a couple of years, maybe, hopefully. We'll see how that goes to volunteer once more. But it's, I think, definitely something you should check out. And there's some cool prizes open too. That's always fun. This is a Neuroethics Today is a podcast series. So maybe if you're, I don't know, at the gym or going for a walk and you want to tune into some neuroethics episodes about interviewing what experts in the field are doing, or just generally some coverage on what are some important things to know about. This is run by Dr. Catherine Basel, who's based out of Europe and who's a friend as well. She's absolutely wonderful, and I think has a very open approach to covering these issues. So I would definitely recommend tuning into that podcast. And the cool thing also is, I think she actually, correct me if I'm wrong on this, a little time ago, she was recruiting some new volunteers to join the team and support her in actually producing the podcast and associated resources. So she may still be looking for volunteers. I think there's a blurb actually right on the homepage of the website I'm looking at right now. So maybe even like reach out to Dr. Catherine and see if you could potentially get involved if you want to do something that's more hands-on, of course. In terms of a little bit more old bay crash course on neuroethics, there's this, I can't believe I'm sending y'all to a Britannica article of all places, right? But I think it's quite useful tracking from start to finish where we are, or start to finish, from start to present where we are so far. An example, if anyone is first of all is based at the University of Washington, you have some really amazing folks sitting right next to y'all, basically, but also a really great example of what are some current research areas happening in the neuroethics space right now, and also some really cool people to just kind of stay in touch and follow their work and see what's going on there. In terms of brain mind, let me pull up that. Give me 1 second. So the infographic that I shared is on these pages with Brain Mind. They're a little bit more focused on, I would say, the neurotechnology side of things. In terms of, I mentioned kind of cross-cultural a little bit earlier, and the reason why that's also such a growing further subset of neuroethics, I don't know if I should frame it as a subset of a subset, but basically, culture is a very prevalent part of our identities, right? And many of us come from, whether it's ethnic, religious, spiritual, linguistic communities. There are so many different layers to our identities. And culture is a really big influence of our health and our social relationships and stigma around many neurological and psychiatric conversations and conditions. So basically, cross-cultural neuroethics tries to see how do we take all of these guidelines that we've put together over the years, many of which are especially based in Western conversations and roots, and really translate those to diverse communities and try to fill, areas of gaps and needs and bridge basically a lot of those gaps by thinking about how we integrate neuroethics and culture together. So that's a very much tip of the iceberg kind of a summary, but it's also quite fascinating in terms of how much you can learn from case studies from different communities around the world, some of which are discussed in journals like Age of Neuroscience, American Journal of Bioethics, Neuroscience, I believe, focuses on a lot of neuroethics works. They are also quite trainee friendly if you ever happen to submit a piece to them, closely connected to the International Neuroethics Society. And the editors and the board are quite wonderful individuals too. So if you ever were to reach out with questions and looking for help, they're really awesome people to chat with. Last thing I want to drop here is these folks are our friends. They're the Dana Career Network and Neuroscience and Society, and you may have recognized them. We partnered with them on the virtual career fair a couple of months ago. I can't believe it's already November. But these folks also have some neuroethics resources on their page, and they have a newsletter that focuses on neurox, or neurox meaning neuroscience intersecting with another discipline kinds of opportunities. So definitely a great source there to keep an eye and keep a finger on neuroethics opportunities too. So whew, that was a lot, right? So tell me what I can tell you, or tell me what I can tell you more about. Any questions you have, anything I can clarify. What questions do we have? And feel free to raise a hand, or if you want to unmute directly or drop it in the chat. Realizing that the question is probably not going to pop up in the Zoom recording. So let me just read part of it out loud. I was wondering if you think that there should be an international regulatory body or something that sets our guardrails for neuroethics. Absolutely. And I would say the International Brain Initiative is one of those groups that's trying to serve as that sort of a coordinating body to, excuse me, basically corral everyone, put them on the same page, and make sure that it's not necessarily a country by country specific thing that's going on, but we're sharing practices across national lines. So I think this is a really great example of a starting foundation and a framework. And the working groups are still continuing to build this initiative out. So what I've kind of understood is that what we're seeing right now on the website is just a sneak peek and a hint of what's continuing to grow as well. Recently, they put out sort of a call requesting feedback from the neuroscience community and everyone in general too, of how they could modify their own guidelines and whatnot. So that's a great question. I think that bodies like these are definitely a really strong foundation point, and especially because they're not necessarily tied to one institution in particular. How does ethics in neuroscience compare to other scientific fields? Is there a certain aspect that I could tell you more about? I think kind of the initial answer that comes to mind is again, we're thinking about more, I don't know if delicate is the right word, but more sort of gray areas of that's relating more to our own identity and our personalities. And I think of, for instance, I always pick on the kidneys, and I feel really bad doing this because kidneys are amazing and nephrologists are amazing. But for instance, um, kidneys are a very vital part of the body, right? You need kidneys to live. But I don't think, for instance, kidneys carry as much of a connection or this connection to human identity and free will and consciousness and all these other intersecting topics as much as the brain itself carries with it, right? Though maybe you could argue this, the stomach being your second brain, as they say, you can have some issues related to that. That'd be kind of fun. But it just, there's so many more ties to human aspects and these broader philosophy questions too, um, that introduce neuroethics as kind of something that's a bit unique in its own identity compared to ethics intersecting with other scientific fields. So I hope that made sense a little bit. Um, let's see here. Haynes dilemma. Let's see here. This is I'm trying to figure out how I'm trying to figure this, Daniel. This is a really great question, but I'm trying to figure out like how we can tie this back to neuroethics. Is there a certain, well, I guess it relates to like more psychology, moral development, but is there like a certain aspect that you're curious about related to that? If you want to drop into the chat, we're interested to learn what kind of prompted that question. I'll jump to the next one in the meantime. We'll come back. For someone with no background in neuroethics, but has a bachelor's and a master's degree in neuroscience and research experience in molecular or clinical neuroscience, is it possible to get into this field? And how does one get involved, for example, as labs or organizations focusing on neuroethics? So some of the organizations I mentioned earlier, links in the chat, I would recommend going through those. And those are a starting point. I think that they themselves, for example, the International Neuroethics Society itself functions and has its own initiatives and programming going on. But also, the further you explore that website, I think you can see, you can go back through past conferences and annual meetings, agendas, and past research. I believe they still have posters available on the website, but also if not, you can still see, for instance, oh, there was this person who presented on X, Y, and Z neuroethics topic. Cool. I'm going to go search them up on Google Scholar. It says they're a faculty member at X, Y, and Z University and see what they're up to. So I think in terms of research positions and internships in neuroethics, because it is, again, such a small niche compared to perhaps research in academia in general, it can be quite difficult to find um, formal programs. So oftentimes, if you're at a university, like let's say the University of Washington, which has a lot of neuroethics faculty and the Department of Philosophy who focus on neuroethics topics, it may be more likely that there's a formal internship program set up in place. But in many other instances, it may be that you have to kind of cold email and cold contact and make those kinds of opportunities open for you. Some individuals, my kind of stance overall is that you don't need to formally study neuroethics to be in neuroethics because you remember that list of like the diverse voices involved? There's a lot of different stakeholders involved, and there really is no one perfect track to becoming the ultimate neuroethicist of all neuroethics. You know, there is really, that does not exist. We need all those different disciplines coming together to form that ideal group of neuroethicists overall. So I think, for instance, thinking back to your own undergrad and master's courses and your own research experiences, what do you see as potential ethical dilemmas there? And if so, use that as your starting point and leverage your past research experience in that area to then build off of it from there. Or you can also completely spin out and choose to do something completely different as a neuroethics topic, but it's a little bit difficult to kind of get your foot in the door in terms of proposing different maybe research collaborations with faculty members or groups versus building off of your current foundation there. So I hope that makes sense a little bit. Basically, I don't think something to add on here is there are some, for instance, graduate certificates out there in neuroethics. Most of them are, again, based at North American or European institutions, and many of them can be pricey. So I think that's something that you personally have to weigh in terms of if you feel that you really are struggling with the foundational aspects, and you can build that foundational aspects through actually hands-on projects. Um, and there's been quite a few, like examples of work that's out there in the field, and you can catch yourself up to speed just through pure reading and attending these kinds of events and meetings like the Neuroethics Society gatherings. But really think about, is coursework the answer to giving the experience, or is it more of the actual hands-on? I've done some projects and I've gotten some papers or case studies, or I've worked through them. I've submitted something to the Neuroethics essay contest, these kinds of outside of the classroom experiences, and weighing that because they can be a pretty hefty price tag. So the fairness for that, just want to bring that up too, as sometimes not even having formal coursework is okay too. It's just you want to basically want to demonstrate to people that you have a sufficient understanding of neuroscience principles that you can translate then into making informed ethics discussions. That's it. And a lot of it is, again, because it's a growing field, is just you got to get your hands and feet dirty and just get on the ground and start doing projects. Thankfully, I feel that because it's not as much maybe perhaps basic sciences or clinical sciences heavy in some way, you don't necessarily have to develop as many technical skills unless you're maybe doing some aspects of clinical research that you're then doing a kind of a neuroethics lens to of a discussion to, in which cases you might be partnered with someone who has those skills. Or for instance, if you're doing more qualitative research and social sciences research, like focus groups or surveys, then maybe you want to have some more skills on how to conduct those kinds of focus groups and navigate those discussions, and then build your, coding, coding out of the sense of like Python, SAS, SPS coding, but coding in the sense of how do I take all these narratives and qualitative discussions and then take meaning out of them, right? So that's a whole different, I think, skill that isn't necessarily the same as maybe like some computational neuroscientists might experience, or individuals working on a wet lab with animal models might experience. It's a whole different kind of an approach. Okay, so how can neuroethics be enforced despite not having an exactly rigid structure, since it is heavily based on morals and gray areas? That's a great. Okay, thanks, Danielle. I understand. The thing is, I think it is very case specific. So, for instance, if you like, it would be saying, well, we have this regulation set up. Cool. We know the X, Y, and Z about all these neurotechnologies and companies coming up, but it's not really a one size fits all approach. I think one part of it is to do our due diligence in making these kinds of early thought discussions happening, so we can take a preventative approach to it. Think about, translations to law and policy. That needs to be preventative and forward thinking rather than reactive in a way. So I think that's one instance in which we want to sort of set the umbrella or the kind of cushion up in place, and hope that it covers most things. But in an ideal world, it really does not cover most cases. Um, and I think neuroethics enforcement versus informing, right? So, for instance, when we're thinking about clinical research studies of deep brain stimulation and ideas like these, I think coming in and with neuroethics being sort of word of caution and being mindful in terms of, okay, is this equitable? Are we making sure that everyone has equal opportunities to access? Can people consent? What exactly is the scope that we're trying to do with a certain research study here? Or in the cultural sense, cross-cultural sense, especially. I think this is quite a pretty prevalent debate of, well, no culture is the same, right? No cultural community is the exact same. So why are we doing cross-cultural neuroethics? And I think the hope is that one, we're sort of reframing discussions from, again, that very Western roots. I think that's a really big part of why we talk about cultural neuroethics too, is trying to embrace all these areas and identities and communities that have not previously been the heart of neuroscience research, and giving space for understanding and informing. If you happen to attend Alyssa Mayers' talk earlier today about community engagement, the word we kind of used there was bidirectionality. So it's about having conversations with communities and learning from them and addressing perhaps misconceptions and pseudoscience and informing them about science and why maybe researchers are seeking to conduct a study in a community, but then also in the other direction to realize that, well, what can we learn from a community and then infuse into our own scientific method. And that's easy to say, tough to do. Uh, so I think there really is no good answer of like what ideally does neuroethics solve in the next 20, 30 years. But I think technology side, we definitely need people who are going to be those kind of like cautious agents, and sounding the alarm when needed and trying to protect patients, protect consumers. And on the cultural lens too, is seeing how we can use neuroethics to build more well-informed, comprehensive healthcare that really tries to fill all those gaps, that takes into account diverse communities and helps us ideally do science and medicine that is fully efficient and effective. For instance, actually, here's an example. Alzheimer's disease as a concept doesn't exist in many communities. It is not a part of the actual vocabulary. There's no direct translation in a certain language. And as a result, how do you really explain the disease and not make sure that you're literally losing information in translation, figuratively and literally? Um, and there have been studies in certain indigenous communities where Alzheimer's is actually associated as a disease that is related to basically Europeans and colonization. Like, oh, this is a disease that has been imposed upon us as a diagnostic form of control, maybe, and not necessarily something that is actually part of our own health. So, varying levels of perception. And we just want to make sure that in those bi-directional conversations, when those happen, that we can make sure that these people understand what's going on with their health and their wellness, that we may find ways to support them and making sure that that care is accessible. So I think that's one example of like what is a good way in which we can use neuroethics to kind of do well and move basically the field post a little bit further in medicine, especially. So that was a long-winded answer. I hope it made sense. TLDR, there really is no like one great solution. We're just trying to make steps towards filling those gaps in neuroscience. Um, will the field of health regulation and ethics standards suffer from changing politics? I would say, in terms of, I think funding is the great elephant in the corner of the room. For instance, the NIH's Brain Initiative funding may be affected by the incoming administration. And I think there's always challenges that are associated with every change in administration. So funding is especially the biggest vehicle, I think, where we may see potentially a lot of things going in directions that we don't wish them to go in. So but we'll just have to keep our eyes peeled, right? And our ears and eyes peeled and open. And I would say regulation side of things, those are always definitely something that we hope would be pretty standard, but they can also be affected by the political climate. So we shall see together and see how it goes. In a clinical setting, how much info should be given to the patient when any device is being used, especially in a case like India, where we have too many patients and the doctors have too less time to explain to everyone? Yeah, again, ideal world, I completely understand this, is you want to sit down and have a 1 hour conversation with everyone. But the actual in the clinical setting, you can't unfortunately do that in all cases. I think the hope overall is going back to that theme of informed consent. Is the patient fully aware of what they are signing themselves up to do, to get surgery, to get a procedure done, to receive treatment for a condition like Alzheimer's, when maybe it's actually against their wishes? So I think it is a matter of the education aspect, supplementing the direct physician patient education with also community and societal engagement, and also looping in interprofessional approaches. So, for instance, I think this kind of a burden has fallen oftentimes on a physician. And I understand that the physician also kind of wears many hats in resource limited settings, or even, it doesn't have to be necessarily a resource limited setting where just perhaps, like you said, there's just such a high ratio of patients to a physician in the span of a day we're doing. This is where I think more collaborations with individuals, nurses, social workers, religious, more, what is the word? Like chaplains and chaplaincy teams, for instance, faith leaders comes into play because they can also help address many aspects of the conversation that go beyond the actual clinical um, clinical parts of it. So what I mean by that, for instance, are maybe we're having end of life conversations here. There is up to a certain point to which the doctor kind of steps in, right, and kind of informs, well, here's the actual like ABCs and all the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about in terms of the physiological things of how you might pass away or decide to pass away. If you're choosing, end of life care, for instance, and what that looks like, multiple paths for you. Try and minimize suffering is why they're there. Then perhaps on the more spiritual side, you may have a chaplaincy team come in and talk about more of these broader questions of um, what is the most meaningful way to spend the rest of one's days, right? That's kind of a philosophy question that's embroiled in there. You may have someone come in who's more of, like social work side of things and make sure that someone has the resources to try and live out their days in the best ways that they wish, related to maybe the end of, a very severe neurological illness like Alzheimer's. So I think in an ideal world, we strive to have more of these interprofessional approaches because it helps share that decision making and conversation among different members of a healthcare team. Um, and yeah, I think it's kind of the ideal hope is that the more community education that we do, for instance, if we were to have a grandparent who's more aware of Alzheimer's in layperson language, because we're having more overall community discussions about Alzheimer's, maybe we're having more social media awareness and advocacy and things like this. And people like ourselves are able to then convey things to our grandparents too. Perhaps I genuinely hope this is not the case for any of our family members. But knock on wood, if any family members happen to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's one day later down the line, I hope there is not as much fear um, or confusion about what a certain condition might be, and that we have increased awareness ahead of time. So, again, TLDR, it involves a pretty multifaceted approach to making that happen. Um, and so, I think the hope in the clinical setting is use as much of that time as we can and see if we can also loop in different team members too. Um, Disclaimer, I am not a physician. I'm physician collaborator, so I'm just kind of using this on secondhand knowledge. Neuroethics address animal research, testing neurotechnologies in animals before humans. So I will say that I do not work as directly or address animal research in my own work. So I don't really have too much, I don't really have like 2 cents to add on this. There's an extensive body of work out there, I will say. I want to say Elsa Johnson. Let me drop her name in the chat. And I believe yeah, actually, oh, perfect. So Elsa Johnson, for example, Dr. Johnson is a really amazing neuroethicist who's worked on some issues related to animal ethics as well, Sophia. So I would suggest going over to who read a little bit more about her works, for instance. I don't know if I actually don't. Well, she is a member of the NIH's Brain Initiative Working Group, so maybe she does have some words that she's put together in past pieces or articles about neurotechnologies as well. I'm not entirely sure, but could be a good starting point. That's definitely an area of discussion up there. It's just something that I don't really specialize in, so I don't want to misspeak about it. Um, yeah, and see a private message here about getting involved in Simply Neuroscience as a high school student. The answer is yes. The answer is also we unfortunately only have a limited number of spots available on the team because we can only logistically host so many volunteers. So volunteer applications recently closed a few weeks ago, and we're hoping to open them up again around summertime 2025, which I know summer is not the same around the world in terms of timeline. That would be roughly around July, August or so, we're hoping. So keep an eye out. And I would say there's also like a mentorship program that opens up periodically throughout the year. That's something that high school students could take a part of. These kinds of events, I hope, are helpful. And we share our news about all of those through the newsletter and social media. So definitely keep an eye out there as well. Okay. Is that all of our questions? Maybe we can take one more or so before we call it a night or call it a morning for some of y'all. All right. So I think we are all out of questions. Those are some great questions, by the way, folks. So thank you for sharing those. With that, we can conclude for today. So thank you all for joining. I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form. Um, it's just kind of, just the opening part to learning a lot more about neuroethics, I hope. So we will see you guys again for day 2 of NeuroNovember. So tune back in. We will be back at, let me see here, the 24th at 9 a.m. Eastern time. So just kind of convert to what that may be in your time zone, 9 a.m. Eastern. We're going to have some poster presentations come up. So that will be exciting. And let me pause here, recording.